Hello, my name is Dr. Jim Doty, and I'm the host of the Into the Magic Shop podcast, where we explore the mysteries of the brain and the secrets of the heart. Hi, this is Dr. Jim Doty, host of the Into the Magic Shop podcast. My guest today is Dr. Robert Waldinger, psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and Zen priest. Dr. Waldinger is also the director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, the longest-running study on longevity and happiness. He's also the author of the best-selling book, The Good Life: Lessons from the World's Longest Scientific Study of Happiness. I hope you enjoy our conversation today, and thank you for listening. Well, Bob, it's great to have you with me today, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And I know you have many things on your plate, and this is probably your 10,000th podcast. Having done, I like that side glance of disapproval. Askance, I guess is the word. But having been on many myself, it's always interesting to sort of process, why are you doing this? But I don't know if you recall, there's a story by by Jimmy Page with Led Zeppelin, and he was asked, well, he used to complain, everyone wants me to play Stairway to Heaven at my concerts. He said, I'm so tired of Stairway to Heaven, I played it a million times. And then he processed this after a while, and he realized that it wasn't about him anymore. And what he was giving people by playing it was sort of a connection to an event or a memory they had that held a lot of importance to them. And then he gained the insight that it's not about him, which I think all of us can learn from that statement.
Absolutely. And that's actually one of the reasons why I keep doing the podcast. As you say, it's important to keep remembering, why are we doing this? And I really care about these ideas.
Exactly. Well, a little bit earlier, before we came on, we were talking about Buddha, since there's one prominent on my left shoulder. And you said you had a lot, which brings me back to actually maybe a question, and I don't know if many people have asked you this. How does someone become a Zen priest? And I'm assuming that was after you went to medical school. Maybe you could just share that experience with us.
Sure. Um, I'm actually now also a Zen master, a Roshi, and which is a teaching. Zen priest is a vow of service, and the Roshi part is the teaching part. Um, but I stumbled into a Zen meditation group about 20 years ago at the local Unitarian church whenever one of my kids' friends was having a coming of age ceremony. And the minister was also a Zen master. And I had been really drawn to the philosophical ideas of Buddhism for many years, but had never been able to sustain a meditation practice. And somebody once said to me, you really need to sit with a group regularly and find a teacher, and then you'll be able to keep practicing. And that turned out to be true. So about 20 years ago, I started doing that. Never dreamed I would get as involved as I have.
That's fascinating. But, it's interesting because I think if you're interested in the human condition authentically, that leads you down this path in the sense of some of the philosophical underpinnings of Buddhism and compassion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've sort of begun to see that all three of the big things I do in my life are about that. It's about the human condition.
So, on that note, uh, I know you have, of course, the book, The Good Life, but and people use this term happiness. Maybe you could define happiness as what happiness is for you. Um, as you know, many people get caught up in the Western capitalist narrative of success, which equates to power, position, and money, somehow leads to happiness.
Yeah, and we know how well that works.
I've
Um,
experienced myself.
yeah, yeah. But so actually, there's research on this, and happiness seems to fall into two big buckets. One is hedonic well-being, which comes from hedonism. It's really the question, am I having fun right now? Um, so, a good meal, a nice party, a nice talk with a friend. Um, and that's moment to moment. And as we know, that comes and goes moment to moment. And then there's eudaimonic well-being. It comes from the Greek. And it's that sense that life is basically worthwhile and okay. And so that's a much more abiding, ongoing sense that isn't subject to the moment to moment ups and downs. And most of us want some of each kind of happiness, but some of us prioritize one kind more than the other. And often at different times in our lives, we prioritize one more than the other.
Well, I think it's interesting though, because when we talk about happiness, we talk about sort of this good feeling of in terms of eudaimonic happiness, sort of looking outward at how others are doing, how they're suffering, perhaps how we can sort of remain connected. But I think what happens sometimes is, though, that people also forget, what gives meaning and purpose, which is very much, I think, interconnected with happiness. But as you said, hedonic happiness oftentimes is quite transitory. And I think eudaimonic happiness is much deeper, long lasting. And I think that is the path to purpose and meaning. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, purpose and meaning are part of that sense that life is basically good, worthwhile. Um, and it really depends on so many factors what you prioritize. Some people don't care about that stuff.
Oh,
And,
yeah,
and some
absolutely.
people just care about making a whole lot of money or becoming super famous. And, uh, it's difficult to decide for any one person what's the right path. I mean, I can say what's right for me, and I can say what has worked well for the thousands of people we've studied over 85 years in our research. Um, but I also see quite a lot of people living very different lives, having very different priorities and different values. Um, the one thing you learn when you study thousands of people over time is one size never fits all.
Yeah, and there's certainly outliers. And, but, it's interesting because part of my life has been as a neurosurgeon. And people will, if they get diagnosed with, let's say, a high grade astrocytoma, or a highly malignant tumor, they'll say, well, what are my odds? And I say, I can tell you the odds for thousands of people. I can't tell you your odds because everyone is different, and different physiology, different immune systems, different events happen in their lives that have a profound influence. But I certainly um, feel the same way, in the sense that I, of course, have run into a lot of people who have completely different uh, uh, perspectives, who are only interested in making money, or uh, chasing hedonic happiness. And I can't say how they feel or how they live, but I certainly know that that lifestyle doesn't work for me.
Yeah, right. Me either.
Yeah, and It's interesting though. As an example, I'm sure you're of course aware of, the statistics on what high school students want to be, right? I mean, if you ask them, a significant percentage want to be rich. A number of them want to be quote unquote influencers, and then there's the other group who want to be famous. Um, and at the end of the day, though, and I think this is why we, as an example, look at many individuals who have chased money or have been influencers, uh, and many of them are miserably unhappy. They're trying to project to others that they live the perfect life. But I think what happens is in our society, people get accolades for some things that I don't think are worth accolades, like chasing money or being an influencer. But that gives them affirmation of their path because so many people want to try that or want to be that, thinking that that's the path. Yet deep inside, many of these people are very unhappy. And that leads to this sort of disconnection and often depression and sadly, sometimes suicide.
Yeah.
Looking at the study that you mentioned earlier, I had initially thought it was primarily just Harvard students, but there was a subset of students who were disadvantaged students.
They were young men from Boston's poorest neighborhoods, but also the most troubled families. Actually, two-thirds of the study members were from that group. Only one-third was the Harvard group. And the two-thirds they were deliberately chosen because they were from families that were known on average to five social service agencies for domestic violence, for severe parental illness, physical illness, mental illness. Um, and the question that the investigators had was, how do children born with so many strikes against them manage to stay on good developmental paths? So it was a study of thriving, but among kids who weren't supposed to thrive.
And maybe you can give us insights into that as to what held them together, because, of course, this is the group who would be now exposed to what we call adverse childhood experiences. And as you know, I mean, the higher that number, the less likely that they will succeed, at least by what typical society considers succeeding.
Yeah. And a lot of this comes from the child development literature that really what they find is that um, children who have a consistent, warm relationship with one adult are much more likely to thrive, even in the face of adversity. And thriving in the face of adversity is the definition of resilience. Doing well when you're not supposed to do well. Um, and Michael Rudder, who's a famous child developmental psychologist, said every child needs at least one adult who's crazy about them. And a lot of these young men in our study had somebody who was their anchor in the midst of what was often chaos.
Well, and I think that's something really important to emphasize. I think that one person can have a huge, huge impact. And I think sometimes, though, what an individual feel is, well, I don't have the ability to impact another person's life. And I think the reality is that you neither have to be wealthy, affluent, connected. You just have to care.
Well, and we're always impacting each other's lives constantly, whether we know it or not. Uh,
Exactly. For good and bad
yeah.
sometimes. One of the, I think, challenges for people that they get lost in, and obviously this will relate to your experience with Buddhist philosophy, is this idea of craving and attachment. And maybe you could, talk about how that can perhaps negatively affect human thriving?
Well, hmm, attachment refers to this idea that, we all have preferences all the time. We're all liking some things and disliking other things and wanting to hold on to some things and push other things away. Uh, and of course, some of the time that's just the truth of life, but some of the time those preferences are totally optional. And Buddhism asks, is it really possible to give up some of those preferences? And if you do, might you actually have a happier time of it? Um, if I throw a tantrum because they're out of chocolate ice cream at the ice cream store, and I really like chocolate ice cream, is that really suffering, or is that just my mind deciding what it wants and what it doesn't want? And so attachment is really, I mean, are we attached to uh, not being in pain? Yes, of course. Are we attached to not being physically ill? Sure. But a lot of what we think we need and think we have to have in our lives is optional. And that's what Buddhist teachings ask us to keep looking at.
Well, and it's interesting you say it because you mentioned your mind creates a value system of what it believes it needs. Oftentimes, that is in contradistinction to what they really need. Sometimes, um, so so you look at this craving attachment, and my point was that oftentimes you can have an unhealthy attachment, which then leads you astray, or you're so focused on that that you forget to be in the present.
Oh, absolutely. In terms of thinking about what you need to get in the future, a lot of focus on that, and you can totally forget what's around you right now. That's wonderful if you just stop and appreciate it. Absolutely.
No, I think that, and sadly, I think that that's a very common issue with many, many people. They're either focused on a past that they cannot change or a future that hasn't existed or doesn't exist yet. And they, at least, my feeling has been that while it's wonderful to set goals, getting lost in that goal and forgetting the present moment really oftentimes leads to unhappiness.
Mm, yeah.
Of course, I'm sure you're familiar with the blue zones,
Hmm.
and I think that work, as well as the work of the Harvard study, very much overlap in terms of what makes someone happy, if we're going to use that term for now, versus maybe human thriving or human flourishing. But regardless, what maybe you can just summarize what the findings are to date of this study.
We just published our 11th book, so there are a few findings, but
Of
probably
course,
the
I would hope so after 85
yeah.
years, right?
But the biggest takeaways have to do with taking care of your health, that it hugely matters for how long you live, and for also how long you stay disability free as you get older. So that means, eating well, not being obese, not abusing alcohol or drugs, um, getting enough sleep, getting regular exercise, all of those things. But they really do translate into disability-free life years in our study. Um, but then the other thing that we found, which we didn't believe at first, was that the people who had the warmest, best relationships with other people lived significantly longer and stayed healthier than the people who didn't prioritize relationships. Um, and that's sort of emerged both in our findings and in many other studies now over and over again in the last 30 years.
No, I think it's interesting. It's a well-established fact, but oftentimes uh, people still feel disconnected or lonely, and uh, uh, part of it is I think living in the modern world creates a lot of stress and anxiety. And unlike those who live in the blue zones or lived that way a few hundred years ago, at least, and maybe you can comment on this, my sense is that in those environments where you are born and where you die in a village, everyone knows you, everyone knows the good and the bad, and and still loves you and takes care of you and watches out for you. And in modern society, you don't have those types of connections. And I think this is one of the reasons that people feel disconnected or they don't feel they can be authentic because they feel that people are going to judge them.
Well, one of the things Dan Buettner talks about in the blue zones is that things are set up in communities and in social structures to make the healthy choices the easier choices, right? So it's easier to connect with other people because everything is set up to do that. It's easier to get regular exercise because you have to walk to do a lot of your daily activities. Um, and so essentially what we find is that our modern life, particularly in cities, is set up to make the unhealthy choices the easiest choices. And that's what we're left with. And then it leads to increasing isolation and poorer healthcare for ourselves.
Do you see a solution in the near term for that, or do you feel it's going to get worse?
um, that's a good question. Um, well, I think people are getting more aware of it, and people are trying to make some of the changes that actually will get us to make the healthier choices. I mean, if you think about the campaign against smoking, I mean, now only 14% of adults smoke. It used to be over half of adults smoked. And that was from a decades long concerted campaign, including taxation and all kinds of things. Seatbelts. Seatbelts were thought to be some communist plot, initially, and now they're just kind of routine. And so many fewer people die in traffic accidents. And so, the question is, can some of these things change over time? The way we deal with food, the way we deal with psychoactive substances. But I think many people are beginning to understand that healthy choices are possible. And then the question is, how do we set them up? How do we make it the easy choice to make?
Well, as you know, I think in the United States, we have a diminishing middle class because the social safety net is being removed. We have ever increasing income inequality. And unfortunately, the prevalence of a lot of numbing agents. And well, I certainly agree that publicity is critically important, or I should say education. But in the context of what seems to be a political process which supports extractive behavior, uh, what are your thoughts on that?
Thoughts on?
Well, society is more focused or is now oriented towards taking away from the majority to give to a very small minority. And in fact, even health sometimes, if you look in poverty communities, we talked about food, you don't have healthy choices there. You have, these small stores that charge a lot and they have ultra processed foods and things like this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, our system rewards a lot of the things that are unhealthy for us, right? So, um, there are just so many incentives to do the wrong things, uh, to create food deserts where people can't get decent food, to market to people the joys of, drinking a lot, the joys of gambling a lot. I mean, think about all now the marketing of, um, gambling that we know destroys so many families. I mean, there's so many things that we do because because it both is appealing in the short term. It's hedonically appealing to lots and lots of people, and it makes lots of money. And those are incentives that are hard to turn around.
No, I mean, it seems like there's a small group of people who are fighting the good fight, and there's a whole lot of corporate entities and extraordinarily wealthy individuals who are trying to counter that.
Yeah, I mean greed, right? Uh, greed, hatred, and delusion. Those are the three poisons of Buddhism. Uh, and a lot of people are full of greed.
Yes. Any insights into how to uh, convert that feeling? My own are that until a profound event occurs in their lives, and either someone close to them suffers from a disease or a condition, or they themselves are brought to the brink of death. Otherwise, it can be very hard to change their mind.
You know, one of the things that used to change minds was the experience of being with people who are very different from you. That's harder now. We live in these bubbles, but you know, one of the things they found was that when people came back, when soldiers came back from World War II, they were actually somewhat more politically open and liberal because they had been thrown together with people who were so different, and they had come to rely on those people and to trust those people and to realize that there were so many different ways to live a life, and so many different cultures and places to be from in the US, that many people began to have more of a sense of openness. Um, and that's harder to get now. It's one of the reasons why some people have advocated for national service for young adults, not military service, but just any kind of service, but particularly where we're thrown together with people who are not like us, and we come to rely on each other and recognize each other in a way that we don't do now.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. In fact, I was thinking the exact same thing about when we had a draft that, at least for most people, involved everyone from lower to upper class, and this connection of being together, relying on each other, was critically important. And I think it gave insights into both classes, the lower class into insight into the wealthy class, and understanding that their lives are not perfect, but also understanding sort of a idea of compassion or connection, and that um, we're all the same. But I think you're right. It's really a problem because, as you said, we live in bubbles. I think it would be great if we brought back a required service for 2 years that was non-discriminatory, that involved everyone. I think that would make a much better society.
Yeah.
Let me switch gears here a little bit, and in some ways, the work you've been doing is a side effect is longevity, and we see a whole cadre of people chasing longevity, but it's not necessarily related to depth of relationships or human connection. And these are the people who uh, oftentimes are in the top 1% who have the resources, and they take 100 supplements a day, and they have designed diets and all of these other things. Any thoughts about that?
About what? About what they're doing?
Uh-huh. I mean, it's in some ways it's like offering um, a small group of people the ability to actually have access to these things, while we still have a significant number of people who don't have any access.
Yeah. Well, it's also the myth that, you know, we can infinitely prolong life and that we infinitely want to. Um, I was listening to a nutritionist once say that all these supplements that are a multi-billion dollar industry, they're just a way of making very expensive urine. And, most of these supplements are of no proven value of any kind. So there are a lot of people jumping through hoops and doing expensive things that don't really count for much. But you're right, there are these huge disparities in who has access to decent healthcare, as well as decent food, as we know. Um, and and that remains a huge problem for all of us because the it drags all of us down when some of us are unable to stay healthy. But the other thing we don't do, I mean, I see a lot of books about the end of aging or reverse aging, and that's just one of those wonderful fantasies, one of those great lies that we tell ourselves, right? Like that's not going to happen. Um, but it is a way to promise that these things we don't want to face, we won't have to face, like old age, sickness, and death. Um, and so I would say that I just watch us all try to run away from the truth of human life.
No, I think that's right. I think in some ways it's uh, promoting a delusion. And as you said, the vast, vast majority of these supplements are completely useless, but it makes up a multi-billion dollar industry. In some ways, and I'm sure some of our listeners will get angry, it is like homeopathy in that you're giving water with a molecule of a substance, or at least it says there's a molecule of a substance, and you're selling that for a significant amount of money. And yet, I think what people don't appreciate in some ways, and you can just look at the placebo effect, how we have immense power within ourselves uh, to impact our bodies and obviously our environment if we so choose.
Mm, yeah.
How do you think meditation and some of these Eastern practices impact uh, well being or human thriving? You were mentioning that you were having a hard time meditating. But that being said, I think we see a lot of evidence that meditation can have a profound physiologic effect in a positive sense.
Yeah. Um, and meditation isn't for everybody. Meditation is something that resonates for some people and for other people, nah, no. So I would say that it's really the process of coming into presence, right? Being present for something that we know has really profound physiologic effects, both on the mind and the body. Um, and that, meditation is one way to come into presence, to keep bringing yourself back to the present moment instead of being lost in thoughts of the past and the future. But it could also be skiing down a slope. It could be gardening. It could be playing music, depending. I think, we talk about states of flow, which are these states where we're really very present for whatever's happening. And so time just seems to pass by effortlessly. We often lose a sense of time. So it doesn't have to be meditation because for some people, that's not really right.
No, I think you're absolutely correct, and I think this is where people get confused a lot because many people think they have to sit on a cushion and have their legs crossed and not attend to anything and just be there, which the very nature of that for a subset of people is stressful. But I think understanding that any activity that brings you to the present helps. In my backyard, I actually have a patio made out of concrete, but between the patio are about 6 inches, and in those 6 inches are loose stones. And it's funny because when I come home often, because I have dogs, they'll all be messed up, and I have children. So But one of my own practices is simply to walk around and slowly push all the rocks back into place. And, it's I think, a very soothing exercise.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, let's talk about psychedelics. Any thoughts?
I don't know much about them. Uh,
Yeah.
I know there's a huge amount of interest, and I know that um, the FDA has approved or is about to approve psilocybin for PTSD, kind of psilocybin assisted psychotherapy. And so I don't know. I think these agents have some promise. And, as with everything we develop, we always overpromise. So for some people, psychedelics seem like they're the answer to everything, which they're almost certainly not. But it does seem like it's opening up some possibilities for people with intractable mental illnesses that um, may really benefit from use of some of these agents.
Well, I think a lot of people, perhaps because of the baggage they carry from their childhood, they don't appreciate that baggage influences every decision they make, and whether it's in terms of relationships, interactions with others, jobs, that it can impede them. And for a subset of those people who've had challenges with dealing with this, uh, there's this idea, and whether it's true or not, but that you can reset your ego, if you will, or dissolve your ego, or whatever terminology, so that that baggage doesn't have as prominent of an influence on you as before.
Yeah, and I don't know that we know whether that's possible or how it works. And certainly it has very different effects for different people, but we can't, we're never going to dissolve the ego, nor would we want to.
Well, like I said, that's a term people use, and you're right. I mean, the ego has a purpose, but it's like everything, as you were mentioning. There are good parts and there are bad parts, and you have to be knowledgeable and understand, I think, the nuances of these things. What what would you suggest for someone who may not know of your work, although that may be a very small few in the face of the popularity and the work you've done? But for those who are sort of just learning about this or want to improve themselves, and we talk about depth of relationships and things like that. Do you have any specific advice? Or, and again, obviously, nothing is easy, but what do you have advice for somebody? And do you think there's sort of an age limit into onto when you can help yourself or when you cannot by these types of recommendations?
Well, there's no age limit. I mean, we've seen people in our study uh, make good, deep friendships for the first time in their 70s and 80s. So, no age limit. Um, the the last chapter of the book is titled "It's Never Too Late" for that reason, and we give stories about that. Um, but I think what people can do. Certainly, they can look at the book, which has a bunch of sort of descriptions of things that people can do. So, in addition to life stories and the developmental science, um, we have a bunch of ideas based on research on how people actually do strengthen relationships, how they make new relationships, um, and it is possible at any age. It often requires sustained attention and a consistent practice.
Well, exactly. And again, I think for some that is a challenge, but I think having knowledge and having more information, for many people can be a motivator. And as you were saying, it's never too late. I think some people feel that way oftentimes. They say, well, then there's no reason for me uh, to do anything. And, it's interesting. There was, and you're probably familiar with it, there was a study, I think it was done in Wisconsin, associated with volunteerism. And I think the people were over the age of 65. And it was interesting in that they had, these various groups of people, but they were matched in some way. But at the end of and I'm probably screwing up the summary of this, but if I recall correctly, uh, those people who volunteered a certain number of hours per week, and these were people over the age of 65, it actually resulted in a 2x increase in expected longevity. And what are your ideas? Oh, and there were two exceptions, though. And if I recall, one was if they were doing it to uh, have secondary gain in the sense of to get an award or to compare themselves with other people, uh, or so that they could brag about it, it had no effect on their longevity.
Hmm. Well, that's interesting. I don't know that study. Um, I mean, I suspect the benefits have to do with the social stimulation and the that affects our brains, as well as our bodies, the physical activity. Um, and we know that when people feel that they are being generous, that they can be generous, they feel better. Uh, that it is one of the kind of core aspects of well-being that people cite all over the world when they do surveys, like the UN World Happiness Report. Um, but whether you just do it to get an award or to compare yourself to other people, I don't know what if doing it for the wrong reasons means you don't live as long. I'd be interested in the mechanism by which that works.
Yeah, and I can't answer that for you. Speaking of that, I'm sure you've heard, or I think it's uh, maybe common knowledge to a lot of people, this idea that increasing wealth does not increase happiness beyond, I think it was $75,000 a year. But it seems as though there's new data out, and I think Dr. Kahneman reported this, that actually the analysis was incorrect, and it actually did show that increasing wealth, even up to $500,000 a year, seemed to be associated with being more happy. Any thoughts on that? Are you familiar with that study?
I am. So Daniel Kahneman and Matt Killingsworth. Matt found he found that happiness kept going up, and Kahneman found that it didn't. And so they did what was called an adversarial collaboration, where they reanalyzed all their data together. And what they did find was that there was still an increase as you got above that $75,000 a year threshold. But that what they found was that the people who were trying to be happier by making more money did not succeed. So the take-home message from their collaboration was that it is not a route to make yourself happier, making more money.
And I think that's probably a good point. Actually, I wanted to ask you a question because we're asking about background, and you were sharing how you became a Roshi. Um, you went to Harvard as an undergrad and went to Harvard Medical School. What is your own background, if I might ask?
Well, I'm Jewish. I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa. And yeah, I mean, I never knew a psychiatrist growing up. I had never heard of meditation, let alone Zen. Um, and it was quite an adventure going from Des Moines to Harvard. It was like going to another planet.
In a good way or a different way?
Well, both in a good way, in that I found some wonderful people who were really, who love to learn and love to talk about ideas, and that was great because I didn't grow up with that very much. But I also, in the Midwest, you don't strut your stuff. You don't tout your accomplishments. And when I got here, there were all these Harvard freshmen telling each other how great they were and how much they'd accomplished. And I was like terrified. I was like, these are like alien beings. So it was both.
It's funny. I have done a lot of work with Google, and it would always be interesting because we would have meetings, and obviously there are a lot of young people, in their early 20s who are working there. And it would always be funny because usually within 5 minutes or so, they would tell you they either went to Harvard or Stanford and tell you their GPA. And it was sort of
Yeah.
and but it is interesting how, and even, I mean, I'm sure you meet people who even today, all of that stuff seems important to them.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And some at one point when my department chair was telling me about these next hoops I should jump through to get a new kind of award, I said I didn't think I was going to do that. And I said to my department chair, I said, all this stuff is all made up anyway. And he looked at me and he said, Bob, too much Zen.
Well, I'm at Stanford and I've been there a while, and it always fascinates me how competitive people are, and this constant comparison always as you go forward. And I've always said I choose not to participate. I just try to do my thing and do the best I can at it, and also recognize that. There's some people who are meant for that path, and I recognize that that just wasn't what I was interested in. But
Yeah.
that takes a time to develop that insight. So you mentioned meditation. Were you well? First question is, why did you go into psychiatry?
Because it was the most interesting thing I found in medicine. Like I realized that I didn't really care very much about physical diseases unless someone I knew had them. So, when we had to memorize the, 12 different kinds of thyroid tumors or this or that, it was just an enormous yawn for me. And, but what I realized was that looking at what made people tick psychologically was really interesting. And so I've realized that I would, I would probably keep being interested in that for many, many years. And because I hadn't had any interest in psychiatry when I started med school.
Interesting. Do you, because I've heard these arguments, and I'm not trying to be confrontational, but there's some people who argue that psychology, psychiatry, therapy, it's a method of no one ever gets better. I mean, how many psychiatrists like say, "Okay, you're better now. You don't need to see me." And I always find that sort of a
I
facet.
do.
Well, besides you, you're the only one in America.
No, I mean,
No, no, I'm just saying that oftentimes people are in therapy for 5, 10, 20, 30 years.
oh, the majority of people, the vast majority I work with are not in therapy indefinitely. No way. They come, they do a particular piece of work, and they leave. And for many of them, it's absolutely life-changing. And many of them say that the emotional suffering that they endure is far worse than physical suffering they've endured. And um, so I think it's a myth, that there's a reason why um, people have needed this kind of treatment for years, uh, including many of my dyed-in-the-wool medical colleagues who are really skeptical of psychotherapy. When they find their way to my office, it's like it's such a relief to be able to talk about what's really going on in their lives.
Would you say a lot of it has to do with prior baggage they carry with them, or is there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that they've come to see themselves in the world in certain ways, and that it can really be helpful uh, to get a glimpse of the world outside of their, you know.
bubble.
What did David Foster Wallace call them? He said, our tiny skull-shaped kingdoms.
Yes. What was the name of that? Is that was that the book about water? What was the name of it?
Yeah,
This
This
is
is
Water.
Water,
Yes.
that wonderful commencement address he
Yes.
gave.
And a very sad story for him, though, right?
Yeah.
Which it's interesting that sometimes people who seemingly have immense amount of knowledge suffer a great deal and don't treat themselves.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, there's a lot of literature that actually looking through the lens of the reality that everyone is suffering and having this idea of compassion and caring for others has a huge positive effect on their physiology.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, first of all, you don't feel isolated. You don't feel like you're the only one who's suffering. There was a minister in the 19th century who said to his flock, be kind, for every person you meet is fighting a great battle.
No, that's exactly right. And I think sometimes people forget that because, focusing on your own suffering, uh, it's interesting. It seems, I don't like the word necessarily self-indulgent, but when you feel you're suffering and you only focus on that, oftentimes that's not helpful. And then when you look out in the world and see other people suffering, it makes you realize that you're not necessarily alone. And in fact, I think there's a body of evidence that demonstrates that that can be a great alleviator of an individual's suffering and help them with their
Oh,
own
yeah.
depression.
Yeah.
What would you suggest to anyone who's listening in terms of how to improve their own lives and be happy?
Well, I would say invest in relationships, that it's got the best payoff in terms of helping people through the hard times and giving them more good times.
Well, I think that says it all. Well, listen, Bob, thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope our paths cross again. Again, thank you for being with us today. The Into the Magic Shop podcast can be found where you find your most popular podcasts, or you can find us at intothemagicshop.com.